I spent 35 years trying to prove a single, unpopular idea, that the language of the great mystics across cultures, whether from dusty monasteries, desert hermitages, or the oral teachings of the East, wasn't poetic hyperbole or religious error, but an account of something they had actually encountered. Then, one night in my backyard, a machine landed, and an intelligence stepped out. It did not preach, it did not proselytize, it simply showed me what those pages had only pointed to it, and in that showing, everything I had held as settled shifted. That is why I say, without theatrical flourish, and with the professional caution that was my habit for decades, an alien revelation altered my understanding forever. If you want to hear more stories like this, subscribe and turn on notifications. I should explain who I was before that night, because credibility matters in these matters of the ineffable. My name is Alan Mitchell. For most of my adult life, I taught comparative religion at a small university in New England. My office looked like a map of obsession. Shelves bowed under commentaries, synoptic tables scrawled across decades of notebooks, annotations in margins that threaded Meister Eckhart to Al-Hallaj, the Upanishads to certain early gospel fragments, St. John of the Cross to the nameless poets of the Vedanta. I wrote what some colleagues called ambitious papers, the kind that asked the hard questions about what language religious people use when they're describing the unnameable. I published a slim book that sold modestly, enough to attract careful skepticism, and enough to make a few powerful reviewers uncomfortable. That discomfort wasn't irrational. I had spent my early career invested in method, philology, historical critical tools, careful contextualization. I had been trained to distrust private revelation as a basis for public claim. The Academy's language is, by design, defensive. It builds fences around what counts as evidence. So when I gradually noticed the same motifs, self-annihilation, the collapse of the subject-object split, language that moves from I to we, repeated across centuries and geographies, I first assumed cultural transmission, then metaphor, then elaborate ritualized psychodrama. My M.O. was to keep pushing the argument until it either collapsed under its own weight or gained the kind of support that could survive peer review. And so I pushed. I chased citations into remote manuscripts, deciphered contested translations, and spent long weeks in archives with a magnifying glass and a flashlight. I argued, sometimes bluntly, that there was a pattern here worthy of explanation. That claim got me invitations to lectures, but not to the committees that granted larger research projects. 2 grant applications were rejected with polite notes about methodological concerns. A senior colleague suggested gently that perhaps my taste for synthesis had outpaced with the data allowed. That was academic code for go back to your archive and stop making us uncomfortable. Comfortable institutions resist changes that threaten the frameworks they are built upon. Both religious and scientific institutions, in their different ways, conserve ways of seeing that are useful for coordinating a community. I recognize the conservatism in ecclesiastical canon-making as a graduate student, how councils decide orthodoxy, how charismatic voices are sometimes absorbed and sanitized, sometimes excised. I also understood the conservatism of materialist science, looking for causes and mechanisms, privileging measurable effects, and often marginalizing questions that appear metaphysical. My work placed me in the uncomfortable overlap between those worlds. I was, in some eyes, an interloper. That history is important because it explains my skepticism, which was genuine and not performative.
If someone claims an extraordinary experience, my first reflex is to ask for corroboration, to catalog possible cognitive biases, to map the social and psychological scaffolding that could produce an illusion of revelation. I'm trained to do this. It is what I do for a living. So when a circular craft appeared above my property and settled like a soft sun on the damp grass outside my study, my initial reaction was not wonder, but rigorous hypothesis testing, weather balloon, clandestine military experiment, elaborate hoax. None of those accounted for what happened next. It was around 2 in the morning. I had been up reading, the kind of solitary midnight reading that scholars know well. The house is quiet, the city hums at a distance, and the only light comes from a desk lamp that throws a small, perfect pool of amber across the nearest shelf. My dog, an old mutt who preferred to snore at my feet, stirred, then stood, then padded toward the back door. I assumed he'd go out and come back. Instead, he stopped at the glass and lifted his head. Outside, the garden was rimmed with a pale glow that had no obvious source. I remember thinking of the sea, how moonlight sits in a doorway and turns a yard into a shallow tide. Then the light condensed into shape, round, compact, neither metallic nor entirely organic. Imagine a sphere that seemed to be made of a material halfway between water and light, the surface moving like slow silk pushed by an invisible current. It was quiet, apart from a harmonic tone I felt rather than heard, a resonant, layered frequency that made the bones behind my teeth hum with recognition. I did what any sensible, middle-aged professor would do. I walked toward the door, with my dressing gown slung over my shoulders and the heel of my hand pressed against the banister. I expected to see a trick of light and shadow, and to return to my books with an interesting anecdote for a seminar. Instead, the sphere lowered itself to the lawn, and an aperture opened, not a hatch, but an unfolding, like a flower parting its petals. A figure emerged. Calling it an alien is imprecise but serviceable. It is the closest word available in our language that doesn't imply a specific humanoid template. It was neither tall nor short, and its outline shifted. Where I expected limbs, there were filaments, thin tendrils of luminous tissue that moved with the grace of kelp in a slow tidal stream. Its skin was porous with points of bioluminescence, each blinking softly as if marking the passage of a thought. The word neutral appears in my memory again and again. The presence felt observational, curious rather than condescending. There was no halo, no theatrical display, no music of conquest. It came like a scientist who has noticed a persistent anomaly and has crossed a field to see it for itself. When it entered my yard, the air did not change temperature dramatically. Rather, it entered into my attention. The mechanism of contact was not oral. There were no words in any language I knew. Instead, a knowledge overlapped my thought space, the way two transparent pages can be superimposed. An undeniable imprint of meaning that arrived entire and complete. The content of that first transmission was not a lecture. The being did not say, "Here is the truth, and you must believe me." It conveyed, without condescension, a single fact, as if it were a factual observation, that my pattern detection over decades had a legitimate basis in experience. The sense was not, "You are right," but "You have observed an aspect of how this reality functions." It felt like the relief of having a hypothesis experimentally verified. This is where I must be careful, because language breaks down. When I attempt to render what I was shown, I am translating a non-linguistic event into words that always fall short. What follows are my best approximations, the metaphors and images that align most closely with that transmission. They are my testimony. I am describing what I experienced, not issuing a theorem. I was invited, if that is the correct verb, into the craft. The interior was not cavernous, but deceptively spacious, as if depth had been folded into the geometry. The walls were neither opaque nor transparent. They refracted light in layers, producing a kaleidoscopic stillness. At the center of the floor there was what looked like a pool of molten gold, but it did not reflect me the way ordinary liquid reflects. Instead, it took my image and multiplied it into different tonalities: my laughter, my grief, my impatience, my curiosity, in separate currents that rose and fell. There was no chair. I did not sit in the way one sits on a bench. Rather, the surface itself seemed to invite one into a posture of openness. Then the experience that had only been hinted at in my scholarship arrived in full force. You may be familiar with the language mystics use. The soul unites with its principle. The self dies and is reborn in the ground of being. The lover loses herself in the beloved.
Those phrases in the academy are often read as metaphor, as stylistic devices used to impress or to poeticize intense devotion. What I felt was not metaphor. My sense of separateness, the boundary that names me Alan and the rest other, thinned until it was like gauze. I did not merge into a giant undifferentiated blob. Rather, the indexical I that had been the center of my experience expanded until it included the garden, the craft, the being, and then what felt like a larger fabric, an ocean of awareness in which forms rose and fell like waves. A metaphor that helped later when I tried to teach students about this experience was the way the sea relates to waves. A wave does not separate itself from the ocean in any ontological sense. It is the ocean manifesting a particular crest, a particular shape. Yet in the moment of its rising, a wave experiences a sense of being a wave. It has limits, a forward edge, a trajectory. The experiential state of being a discrete self, I learned in that ship, is a kind of local conditioning within a larger continuity. The conditioning grants a particular perspective, the thrill of distinctness, a sense of agency, the friction needed for evolution. But underneath, the substrate remains one. The craft's transmission layered on another insight, that separation has a purpose. Dissolving the metaphysics into a simple moral or an airy spiritual platitude would be a mistake. The sense I received was neither judgmental nor celebratory. It was clinical, as if a researcher had presented a model. An ocean of awareness differentiates into forms so that awareness can experience itself through multiplicity. This differentiation involves a mechanism of forgetting. The forms are structured to be relatively ignorant of the substrate so that genuine novelty and suffering, joy and discovery can arise. It's not shy of pain. It makes room for pain because pain produces a type of learning and compassion not possible in an eternally self-aware, unvaried presence. As the expansion proceeded, I felt not only the unity but the mechanics of particularization, the texture of how a single awareness could fragment into billions of vantage points without losing its essential identity. Imagine a single white light passing through a prism and dispersing into a spectrum. Each color has different frequencies and patterns, but the source remains the same. The experience was striking less because it solved a puzzle than because it created a moral imperative. Recognition of sameness did not dissolve responsibility. Instead, it amplified it. If this indeed was how things internally operated, indifference toward another's suffering was no longer a private ethical stance, but a contradiction in terms. All this came in a cascade that lasted, in ordinary chronological terms, perhaps an hour. Subjective time dilated in curious ways.
Some sequences felt like an eternity of insight condensed into a handful of seconds.
I saw in images rather than propositions the play of creation, forms emerging and emerging, a vast luminous field that enacted itself through innumerable appearances. I was shown, not in a language of dogma, but in intense visual haptic sensation, how a single consciousness might engage in what looked like a cosmic improvisation, fragmenting to taste new flavors of being, forgetting so that its experiences could be authentic. I felt the split between observation and participation collapse. There was recognition, an immediate, visceral recognition that had nothing to do with intellectual assent. Tears came without my permission. At one point I laughed, and then realized I was laughing with a grief so ancient it had no proper language. An image that returned often in later recollections, and one I still use in lectures, was of ripples on a golden stillness. Each ripple was a life, with its own trajectory, its own joys and sorrows. The ripples did not contradict the stillness. They were that stillness in motion. But because ripples seem to have independent edges, we behave as if the ripples are all there is. The revelation in the ship was a simultaneous knowing of both layers, the ripple's specificity and the ocean's continuity. There were other things the being showed me, scenes that remain too vivid to dismiss, not episodic memories as I usually recall events, but compressed essences, a city of scholars debating whether experience counts as evidence, an abbey where a voice refused to bow to dogma and was labeled dangerous, laboratories where anomalous results were quietly set aside as noise. These varied images were not accusations. They appeared as patterns, part of a larger narrative about how complex systems manage anomalous information by absorbing, silencing, or reinterpreting it. The point was not to blame individuals, but to show me that the phenomena I had studied were not merely curious linguistic coincidences. The same pressures of power, of social cohesion, of epistemic conservatism shape what communities accept as knowledge. When I asked, in that unspoken way that the craft allowed, why such revelations were rare, the answer was practical rather than mystical. Not everyone is oriented toward the kind of existential risk and discomfort that such insight entails. Societies gain stability by assuming boundaries. People derive meaning and functional safety from believing in the separateness of their identities and systems. Someone telling a community that its fundamental orientation is mistaken threatens those stabilizing arrangements. Institutions, whether religious or scientific, have incentives to preserve frameworks that sustain them. That observation did not come dressed as an indictment. It came across as a systemic description, like an anthropologist explaining why certain rituals compile into durable patterns. I was not surprised by that explanation. My years of research had prepared me to see these patterns.
What startled me was the emotional weight, the undeniable ache that accompanied the knowledge. If forms are expressions of a single ground, then the suffering of any form is, at some level, the suffering of the whole. The recognition of sameness intensifies the moral horizon. It is one thing to read a mystic's line about unity as a metaphor. It is another to feel the consequences of that unity pressing on your chest like a physical weight. I left the craft with a sense of responsibility that I had not known in prior decades. Academic disputes felt suddenly trivial compared to the imperative of caring. Even as the craft's experience imparted these insights, it was careful. It did not instruct me on doctrine. It did not command a new religion. It presented a model and then left me to grapple with its consequences. That restraint mattered to me as a scholar. Here was an intelligence that validated experiential claims without claiming to be a spiritual authority.
It felt, in some disorienting way, like a corroboration from outside my cultural echo chamber. When I stepped back into my garden, the night had resumed its ordinary textures: a thin mist, the metallic tang of the air after rain, the distant diesel whine of a late truck. The dog had resumed his sleeping posture, as if no cosmic visitation had occurred. I stood for a long time, holding a book that seemed suddenly inadequate. The pages felt like maps of a territory I had only been circling. The graduate student in me catalogued possible physiological confounds: sleep deprivation, hypnagogic imagery, neurological event. The scholar catalogued historical precedents. The human being simply felt changed. In the weeks that followed, nothing about my credentials changed. My CV remained the same lineated document. My inbox still contained referees' comments, sometimes dismissive, sometimes bored. Yet everything in me had shifted, not just the content of my beliefs, but the urgency with which I felt drawn to translate this experience into practice and pedagogy. I knew with the stubborn clarity of someone who has seen a pattern appear under a microscope that what I had experienced should be treated as an item of data. It was my job, once more, to put method to it, to test it in ways compatible with both rigor and the honesty of subjective report. Before I could formalize anything, before I had time to write the usual cautious conference abstract that would have turned this into a sanitized case study, other small things began to happen. Students came to my office with questions about suffering and compassion. Colleagues mentioned in passing the puzzling nature of some neurological reports that didn't fit comfortably into standard models. A former student sent a message saying cryptically that she had had a small window of the same feeling I described during a meditation retreat. These coincidences accumulated into a soft pressure.
I found myself in a peculiar position. I possessed an anomalous datum that both confirmed decades of research and demanded a mode of transmission that would not reduce it to mere spectacle or esoterica. It is worth pausing here to note the posture I adopted at this juncture. I could have done any number of things: hoard the experience as a private certainty, advertise it loudly to attract attention, treat it as an object of theological declaration, or attempt to reframe it through existing academic categories until it fit. I chose none of those options. Instead, I adopted a stance that felt like both humility and obligation. I began to teach with the aim of inducing careful, replicable experiences, small practices that could be tested by students without requiring belief. My initial goal was modest: not to convert, but to catalyze conditions in which others might have genuine insight and then report it. If the narrative thus far has a tension, it is this: how does one take a private, undeniable experience and make it public without losing the quality that made it convincing? That question is where my work turned next, and it is also where I will leave you now, because the next sequence, the deeper vision, the historical context I was shown, and the way those images reframed centuries of institutional responses, needs room to breathe. I will say only this before I pause. What the craft revealed about patterns of suppression was neither simple nor vindictive. It was structural, sometimes tragic, and always instructive. The images returned to me like attended constellations, scholars debating, a voice burned at a stake, councils convening, an experiment quietly shelved, and each one suggested ways knowledge can be contained, reinterpreted, or erased. But even as those scenes unspooled, the craft offered practical clarity about next steps. It did not hand me dogma, it handed me exercises. 3 short practices I could demonstrate that evening to the first student brave enough to ask. They were concrete, mundane, and meant to be lived rather than theorized. I will describe them and the first results in what follows.
You might be inclined to judge them as obvious or inadequate in the abstract. That would be reasonable. Test them. See what they do. For me, they became the scaffolding by which this revelation moved from being an isolated event to something that could be integrated into daily life. And that integration, with all its oscillations between remembrance and ordinary forgetfulness, is the most difficult work of all. That evening, still wearing the residue of the craft's impressions like a second skin, I walked my student back through what I could teach without collapsing the thing into a sermon. The 3 practices the being had given me were not mystical rituals in the exotic sense. They were practical, short, repeatable, and deliberately unglamorous.
I taught them that night with the care of someone introducing a delicate instrument. Explain the purpose, demonstrate the movement, and invite careful report. The first was the conscious pause. It is astonishing how rarely we stop long enough to check whether our reactions are coming from a story or from perception. The instruction was simple. 3 times a day, mid-morning, mid-afternoon, and as things begin to press in the evening, take a breath and notice what is arising. Not an exercise in analyzing, judging, or fixing, but a micro-skill of recognition. What emotion holds your attention? What thought claims priority? Is there physical tension? The being emphasized brevity. The pause was meant to interrupt automatic reactivity long enough to allow a different register of attention to register. A moment where the conditioned self is seen as a pattern, not as the whole. On paper, that looked pedestrian. In practice, it functioned like a small hinge. In the first week, my students reported the expected banalities: less snappy replies to email, a more measured response to a difficult colleague, and awareness of anger before it hardened into argument. But some accounts surprised us. A student who had struggled for years with panic described a pause that arrived like a comma in a breathless sentence and opened a space where fear could be named and not swallowed. Another spoke of how the simple act of halting before speaking in a family conversation prevented a festering hurt from being widened. These were not cures. They were openings, small discontinuities in habitual flow that allowed something else to be perceived. The second practice the craft suggested was recognition in others, a disciplined, momentary noticing that the person across from you is not merely an object of preference or annoyance, but a living expression of the same operative ground you just touched that night. We called it seeing as expression, and it required 2 brief moves. First, for 30 seconds, allow visual attention to soften. Don't fixate on traits, but allow the face, posture, and the tone of voice to be present without immediate categorization. Second, allow a micro-intent to arise, the wish that the other's well-being might be as significant as your own. The being insisted this was not sentimental. It was a recalibration of moral salience. When you recognize someone as not wholly other, small acts of care cease to feel optional. At first, students thought this trivial. Then they noticed consequences. A teaching assistant who had been brusque with undergraduates began leaving time at the end of office hours to ask a simple question: "How are you, really?" and found disclosures that shifted grading conversations into mentoring ones. A man who had previously crossed the street to avoid a homeless person instead lingered long enough to offer a bottle of water, and later a referral to a service. You can measure compassion by its effects. The moment someone's need is acknowledged, systems of care can move. The practice did not remove social complexity. It nudged human actors toward tolerances that institutions often underprovide. The third exercise was gratitude at the threshold of sleep. The craft framed this not as a religious duty, but as a neurological reinforcement. Before sleep, name aloud or in silence 3 things that carried meaning that day. Not grand events, small observations count. A cup of tea tasted like a benediction. The neighbor returned a lost key. You caught yourself in the pause. The being explained, again in a manner that felt almost anatomical, that gratitude stabilizes circuitry of attention toward noticing, which in turn makes re-recognition of unity more likely. It sounded mechanistic, but the practice felt tender. Once, exhausted after a lecture, I whispered thanks for my students' courage to ask a hard question. The gratitude softened a gnawing impatience that had otherwise lingered. Together, these three formed a minimal toolkit: interrupt reactivity, reorient moral sight, and reinforce noticing in memory. Over months, I taught them in seminars and retreats. The early accounts were modest, a greater calm and traffic, less reactivity at the dinner table. Yet a pattern emerged. Where the practices were repeated, people reported brief windows, sometimes very brief, of the same recognition I had felt in the craft, a dissolving of the boundary, a sense of being continuous with others and the moment. Not everyone experienced this. Some were skeptical. Some could not set aside inherited frameworks of self, and some found the exercises inadequate to the depth of their suffering. I never claimed universality. I regarded these reports as data points, reliable enough to pursue, not conclusive in themselves. It is worth pausing to summarize what the craft did not do. It did not deliver a new creed. It did not authorize me to revise sacred scriptures. It did not give me a free pass to moral laxity. If anything, the clearer my sense of continuity became, the harder moral questions appeared. This was one of the craft's more unnerving lessons. A metaphysics that collapses division does not excuse harm. It makes harm intolerable. The person who recognizes another as an expression of the same ground cannot easily rationalize cruelty. Thus, the ethical load of the revelation was heavy and immediate. The craft also clarified why institutions have reacted as they have to similar claims. It showed me four broad mechanisms by which anomalous experience is managed: excision, absorption, reinterpretation, and marginalization. Excision is the most brutal and archetypal. The person who presses a community beyond its tolerable uncertainty is sometimes removed by banishment, imprisonment, or, in history's far more terrible, execution.
Absorption is subtler. The innovative voice is co-opted, its language sanitized, and its radical edge made safe for institutions. Think mystics becoming saints with their more difficult insights domesticated. Reinterpretation recasts the anomalous event into existing conceptual schemas, often stripping it of its boundary-breaking implications. Marginalization, our era's default, simply sidelines the anomalous as interesting noise, an eccentric datum, filed and forgotten. These mechanisms are not conspiratorial inventions. They are emergent properties of groups that rely upon shared expectations for survival, coherence, and authority. The same dynamic played out in my vision across cultures. I remember an image of early Christian communities debating which voices would define orthodoxy. A later scene in which a Sufi poet's utterance of union was read by political authorities as sedition. An East Indian teacher whose radical challenge to caste norms was quietly edited from lineage texts. The craft presented these as patterns, not as moral indictments of individuals, but as lessons about the costs and benefits of epistemic conservatism. When I returned to archives after the encounter, I read with these patterns in mind and found myself seeing familiar texts differently, not because the texts had changed, but because the cognitive frame through which I read them had shifted. I noticed how passages in the Gospel of Thomas, where a saying suggests the kingdom is within and hidden, had been relatively marginalized in some Orthodox compilations. I saw how certain mystical utterances were preserved as devotional poetry while their political urgency was eroded. I found the same kinds of compressions in other traditions, and with each instance, my sense that mystics were describing actual states, not merely employing rhetorical devices, deepened. But the craft also warned me about misreading history as a straightforward tale of suppression. Institutions can be protective. Canonization sometimes preserves texts that would otherwise be lost. Scholarly gatekeeping can prevent fraud. The point the craft made repeatedly was structural complexity. The same processes that stabilize knowledge can also calcify it. This ambivalence required careful moral judgment on my part. It was not a simple matter of arming myself with a corrective manifesto and naming villains. Rather, it demanded a humility in reconstructing the past and a caution in prescribing futures. Science's role in this ecology deserves a careful word. My academic colleagues often accused me of romanticizing mysticism at science's expense. I do not. Scientific rigor has delivered extraordinary goods: vaccines, sanitation, tools for extending human flourishing in measurable ways. But the craft highlighted a structural blind spot in dominant scientific paradigms: the tendency to treat consciousness as an epiphenomenon, a derivative of material processes, rather than an irreducible aspect of reality.
The hard problem of consciousness, why subjective experience accompanies physical processes, remains unresolved. The being's message was not anti-science. It seemed to observe that materialist reductionism furnishes an efficient explanatory model for many phenomena, but struggles to accommodate first-person experiences that report non-separateness. Within science, there have been and are individuals willing to move beyond rigid materialism. I had read and admired their work, the careful neurophenomenologists, the clinicians whose case studies of non-ordinary states resist facile explanation, the few physicists who entertain consciousness-first models, not as metaphysical hand-waving, but as hypotheses to be probed. The craft seemed to be saying that paradigms do not change easily. Those who attempt to push consciousness into central explanatory roles risk ridicule, loss of funding, and marginalization. Again, these are not villains, they are systemic effects. Funding bodies and publication norms favor conservative hypotheses because they scale. Novel frames require new instruments, cross-disciplinary patience, and often decades of incremental work. One historical image that stuck with me was of a modest laboratory where anomalous readings, EEG signatures during meditation that did not conform to expected baselines, were archived in a drawer instead of pursued, not because the scientists were malicious, but because institutional incentives made such pursuit costly. The craft seemed to ask not for denunciation, but for pragmatic reform. Create channels for anomalous data to be gathered, cross-validated, and discussed without ridicule. In my post-visit life, I found myself reaching out to sympathetic neuroscientists and psychologists, not to proselytize, but to design methodologically honest studies of the practices I taught. The work is slow and at times dispiriting, but it is also, when done well, the only plausible way to move from anecdote to a robust interdisciplinary dialogue. Ethically, the implications fractured into immediate and long-term concerns. Immediately, there was the question of how to live with the recognition that other beings are not wholly other. I had to examine obligations I had neglected. I found a list of embarrassments: students I had dismissed as exaggerating, staff whose implicit labor I had underappreciated, people outside my social circles whose needs I had rationalized away.
Recognition is not merely a warm sentiment, it is a corrective to moral blindness. That realization moved me into practical work, supporting local initiatives, mentoring students from marginalized backgrounds, and using departmental privileges to redistribute resources more equitably. None of these actions dissolved structural injustice, but they were applications of the insight in ways that institutions could actually implement.
Longer term, there was a theological and philosophical question. If everything is an expression of one ground, how do we adjudicate moral responsibility? The craft gave me no absolution. It showed how agents operate within conditioned roles. It also made clear that role does not erase the moral agency one has within it. If a person in power harms others, the non-dual metaphysic does not cleanse the action of its consequences. Instead, it reframes the moral conversation. We must hold perpetrators accountable while simultaneously recognizing their embeddedness within systems that shaped them. That double bind is difficult. It refuses simple narratives of blame or of excusing. It pushes toward practices of justice that are restorative without being permissive, an ethic that takes both individual agency and systemic causality seriously. There is, inevitably, the question of psychological integration. Experiences of radical non-separation can be destabilizing. People may experience depersonalization, derealization, or an ecstatic lift that makes ordinary obligations feel trivial. Some of my students, encountering these insights too rapidly or without support, experienced moments of disorientation. My pedagogical stance evolved to include grounding practices, maintaining relationships, continuing professional responsibilities, and building a community of practice where reflections on the experience could be safely incubated. We developed protocols for care. If someone reported overwhelming changes, we paired them with mentors, suggested clinical evaluation when necessary, and discouraged isolation. Spirituality that detaches from ethical structure tends toward fantasy. Integration without accountability tends toward delusion. We guarded against both. Over time, I also became attentive to ordinary ego defense mechanisms. The first is rationalization, turning the experience into a clever explanatory theory that justifies existing desires. The second is inflation, interpreting the vision as an endorsement of one's own righteousness. The third is avoidance, using the revelation as an excuse to disengage from moral work because it's all one. I watched these unfold in myself. There were moments when I felt, with uncomfortable clarity, the temptation to use the experience as leverage, intellectually, socially, even financially. I refused those temptations publicly and privately reminded myself of the craft's restraint. It had validated an experience, but had not endorsed me as its custodian. Teaching the practices revealed another humbling pattern: oscillation. Integration is not linear. There are high-phase weeks where the pause is constant, the recognition comes easily, and gratitude anchors sleep. Then there are months when old habits reassert themselves. Impatience returns, moral sight blurs, compassion requires deliberate effort. I came to see this oscillation as endemic to human life rather than as failure.
The craft, I began to tell students, did not grant a permanent state. It offered glimpses, call them glimpses, not epochs, of a broader truth. The task was to build a life that made glimpses more frequent and stable, not to expect permanent elevation. Sometimes the regressions are instructive. In a period when my partner and I argued about money, my old distraction mechanisms, overwork, intellectualizing the relationship, reemerged. I noticed with embarrassment how quickly I could talk about unity in seminars and then fail to listen when asked about a shared bill. Those moments of hypocrisy were painful but necessary. They taught me that metaphysical insight without relational practice is brittle.
I apologized, we negotiated new routines, and I used the pause practice before financial conversations. The practices are not a shield from human failure. They are tools that, when used honestly, reveal where repair is required. A question I'm often asked is whether the craft conferred any cognitive advantage, some heightened intellect or prescience. It did not. My memory remained fallible, my reasoning still required effort, and my habits were stubborn. What changed was the metric by which I judged significance. Before the visitation, I measured success by publication, citation counts, the occasional grant. Afterwards, those metrics felt smaller. Significance shifted toward actions that mitigated suffering and invited connection. Professional accomplishments still mattered. They fund work, pay for students' support, give platforms, but they were no longer the ultimate measures of a life well lived. This recalibration created tensions in my relations within the academy. Some colleagues were moved and curious, others were skeptical and at times dismissive. I learned to occupy both spaces with equanimity. With supportive peers, I opened dialogues about designing studies and interdisciplinary workshops. With critics, I welcomed rigorous critique and used it to refine methodology. When dismissive remarks crossed into personal antagonism, I relied on institutional norms, collegial review processes, transparent methods to protect the integrity of the work. I made a deliberate decision to let robust critique sharpen the research rather than to turn critique into grievance theater. There were moments of real consequence. A prominent journal declined an article we submitted that reported the preliminary results of a study measuring the effects of the pause on stress markers. The reviewers were polite but unconvinced. It would have been easy to interpret the refusal as institutional suppression, the very pattern the craft had shown me. I resisted that facile reading. We revised the methodology, increased the sample sizes, improved the statistical control, and resubmitted elsewhere. The work is now published in a different venue, measured and modest in its claims. Slow progress, not grand declarations, is the pace of credible change.
Students, however, kept the story alive in ways academic journals could not. One student, Mara, deepened her practice and years later brought reports from a healthcare clinic where she volunteered. Nurses who engaged with the recognition practice began to report less burnout because small acts of intentional seeing rekindled the sense of vocation that had drawn them to care in the first place. Another former student, now a teacher in public schools, used the pause practice with adolescents who were otherwise unreachable. The results were modest but meaningful. Improved classroom climate, a few fewer blow-ups, a handful of students reporting that they felt less alone. These are not sweeping social miracles. They are incremental transformations that ripple outward when held over time. I also published cautiously. My writing shifted from polemic to casework, essays that explain the experience, describe methodology, and invite replication. I included rigorous caveats everywhere. This is what I experienced, I would repeat. This is what a handful of students and collaborators reported. I resisted the temptation to universalize. The craft's very neutrality, its refusal to give me dogma, made me ethically conservative in my claims. There were costs. Some friends feared I had abandoned the rigorous skepticism that had made me a trusted scholar. Others accused me of attention-seeking. I took these critiques seriously. The craft's validation did not exempt me from accountability. When questioned, I opened my notebooks, shared anonymized data, described methods. If people dismissed the experience, I did not attempt to convert them. If people wanted to test the instructions, I invited them. The posture I adopted, that of the scientist practitioner, felt honest to me. Testable practices, documented results, and a readiness to be corrected.
Years passed, and the initial visceral intensity of the craft diminished into a companionable background hum. The memory retained its power, but the day-to-day work became the practice of showing up, teaching, consulting, writing, and living. The original night remained a hinge in my narrative, but not a grand closure. I found that the craft's greatest gift was not revelation alone, but the demand it placed on me to translate revelation into accountable, reproducible practices. People sometimes ask whether I regret telling the story publicly. The visibility brought scrutiny and a few uncomfortable encounters, but I answer without hesitation, no. There is value in making an experience testable in public space. It invites both critique and collaboration. It prevents spiritual experiences from becoming private idols. We need public processes for sorting meaningful insights from personal myth. If this account leaves you with a single practical invitation, it is this: try the practices for a season. Do not expect the ship in your yard. Expect subtlety.
The conscious pause is a tool for noticing automatic reactivity. Seeing others as expressions is an ethical recalibration that becomes a habit when practiced. Gratitude at night is a small neurological rehearsal for noticing. Record what changes. Be honest about regressions. If you are in an environment where intense experiences could be destabilizing, find a mentor, a clinician, or a community with whom to work. Before I close, I want to speak to a temptation that sits at the edge of narratives like mine, the need to convert revelation into certainty. The craft taught me to hold paradox. I can describe experiences with clarity and still accept that my interpretation is one among many possible maps. The language of non-duality has resonances across traditions. I felt those resonances in the craft and in the texts I love, but resonance is not proof, it is invitation. My role is not to tell people what to believe, but to show what I saw and to offer tools that might allow them to see for themselves. So as I end, let me return to the question that haunted me for decades. Who created the world? The craft reframed the question for me, and it may do so for you. The more generative question I found was not how the world began in a linear sense, but how we live given the possibility that separation is not ultimate. Once that possibility lodges in your body, you are faced with practical choices. Do you behave as if others matter? Do you structure your life so compassion takes precedence over convenience? Do you build institutions that reward care rather than hierarchy for its own sake? These are empirical, ethical, and political questions more than metaphysical certainties. If you have listened this far and feel a stir of curiosity or disquiet, I invite you to test the practices I've described. See what happens over a month. Keep a simple journal. When you paused, what happened? When you practiced recognition in others, what shifted in your behavior? At the close of each day, what 3 things did you name in gratitude? Share your report with someone you trust or in a community of practice. If you want support, I have prepared a short practical guide that collates the exercises, the protocols we used for preliminary studies, and reflection prompts for integration. You'll find a link in the pinned comment below this video. I cannot give you the certainty I once chased in dusty manuscripts. I can only invite you to the method that made the difference for me. Careful observation, modest practice, and public accountability. If what I describe resonates, test it with curiosity and rigor. If it doesn't, keep testing. Skepticism, when combined with genuine inquiry, is a noble path. Either way, live in a way that makes responsibility unavoidable.
That, more than metaphysics, is the practical consequence of the night I stood in my yard and an intelligence from elsewhere validated what mystics had whispered for centuries. The habit of forgetting is deep, and the labor of remembering is our urgent and ethical work. If you want the short guide I mentioned, the practices, study notes, and reflection templates, check the pinned comment.
The resource is free and meant as a map, not prescription. If this story touched something in you, leave a comment describing what you noticed. I read them, and my students and I learn from every careful report.